Welcome back to Project Command. On today's episode, I'll be answering some of the most recent questions that we've gotten. And remember, if you have a question, send us an email at projectcommandpodcast@gmail.com. That's projectcommandpodcast@gmail.com. We'll do our best to answer it either directly or on air in a future episode like this one. And remember, if you're enjoying this podcast, it really helps us if you like and subscribe. We don't have any advertising, so we really count on you to help us get the word out. So please share an episode with a friend or leave us a review on your platform of choice. Also, we've got a couple quick announcements before we get into the episode today. The first is our book that myself as well as a couple of my colleagues are writing, which is titled Project Management in the Fire Service, is going to be coming out in about 30 days, and really excited about this book. And I think you guys are going to really like it. We've broken down everything you need to know, and I mean everything, to effectively manage a project in the fire service. And we've got a lot of examples and some images, and we really break it down. Everything we talk about on the show and more, all the different experiences and information that we've collected, lessons learned, all that kind of stuff. And so we're going to be releasing a lot more information on that in the next week or so. And that's going to include, where you can buy it, all that kind of stuff. Spoiler alert, it's going to be on Amazon. And we're just really excited to get this book out there. So we think you're going to find it really useful. So keep your eyes open for that. And the other thing, our second announcement, is Duke and I are going to be at FDIC this year. And we would love to connect with any and all of our listeners out there. So if you're going to be in the area, drop us a line, either message either one of us on LinkedIn or send me an email at projectcommandpodcast@gmail.com. We'd really love to chat with everybody, meet anyone that's out there, discuss some ideas, whatever you want to do. We would love to connect with our audience. So if you're going to be there, please consider dropping us a line. Love to meet up, grab a drink, something like that. So, okay, well, that's it. Let's get into the episode. Okay, guys. Well, today we are answering questions. So, and I'll just say I actually really enjoy doing this, and I've been trying to do it more because, I think that the best way to really explain things is just to figure out like what's resonating and what's not, and to kind of figure out like what ideas need a little bit more clarification. So I really love engagement from the audience and getting these kinds of questions. So I'm going to get through as many as I can today. But I'm going to try to give really good comprehensive answers. So, some of these answers may run a little bit long, just because I really want to make sure I answer them. So, anyways, let's just jump into the first one here. How can fire service leaders apply formal project management frameworks like PMI without overcomplicating operations? Man, what a great question. What a great question. So this is what I would say to that. So I've often given the example of ICS. And so here's what I mean by that. If you get dispatched to a kitchen fire today, you're going to show up and you're going to use ICS, right? You're going to establish command. You're going to maybe designate a safety officer. You might have a fire operations group, rescue group, something like that. But you're not going to really do that much ICS on a kitchen fire, right? You're not going to have a planning section. You're not going to have a finance section and all this stuff. And the reason is that that's too much. That would be really overcomplicating it. So what we all sort of inherently understand about ICS is that you have to scale it so that it's appropriate for the specific use case. Now, if you were to go to a plane crash into a mall, God forbid, you're going to need to set up everything. You're going to have a finance section, which is getting money moving through. You'll have a logistics section. You'll have all the things. You're going to expand that ICS chart out to the maximalist possible expansion. And it's really similar with project management. So if you go to like looking at PMI documents or whatever, you'll see that there are what they call the 49 process groups. And the 49 process groups is kind of a fancy way of saying the 49 steps of a project. And it's like everything. It's basically, think about the 49 process groups like it's an ICS chart that's been expanded all the way out to its maximum expansion. And you just like with the ICS, you don't need to do all those things. So I would say that how you implement PMI or Project Management Institute frameworks without overcomplicating things is you just really need to scale what the project management framework that you're using to the situation that you're using it. But easier said than done, right? How do you know how big the PMI framework needs to be? Well, let me just say, there's a few elements of a project that really should be present every time. Every project should have a scope, of course. Every project needs a budget. Every project needs a schedule. I really like making sure that you have a communication plan, which is just how are we going to communicate both internally and externally? Almost like, hey, if you're on this project team, you're going to hear from me twice a week. We're going to talk at our weekly meeting, and you're also going to get a check in the middle of the week or whatever. And if you're a stakeholder or the project sponsor, which is, the person who authorized the project, you're going to get an update from me once a week or once every other week or once a month or whatever. And so the communication plan just kind of sets those expectations. So I really like having that on a project. I, I'm tempted to say every project needs to have some sort of risk forecasting and basically just, think about, if you're sailing a boat from the United States to the UK and there's icebergs out there, it really behooves you to try to figure out, hey, where are these icebergs so that we make sure that we don't hit them. And there's icebergs that you don't know about, and you just kind of have to deal with that as they come. But it does behoove you to kind of figure them out on the front end if you can. So I like to do some element of, excuse me, of risk mitigation in every project. So, kind of to get back to the question, when you're figuring out how big your project management framework needs to be, I would consider a couple of factors. Number one, is this work you've done before? And there's a lot of projects that we do all the time. You're deploying new equipment, building a new fire station, specing a new apparatus, putting a new tech system out there like a Telestaff or Image Trend or something like that. And if it's something that we've done before or something that we do regularly, you want to go back and look at what it looked like last time. And of course, it's not always going to be like it was before, but that'll give you a place to start. Hey, was this a 5-person team or was this a 20-person team? Did this take 3 months or did it take 3 years? Did it cost 5,000 or did it cost 500,000? So just look back at historical precedent to see kind of like where you can estimate that it'll be this time. So that's a really good place to start. Another thing when you're figuring out how big the PMI framework needs to be to scale it is talk to experts. And, you know, this is a key element of every project is figuring out who your stakeholders are. And so ask them questions, figuring out like, hey, how many people do we need to have working on this, or how complex does this need to be? So that's another really important tool. And the last thing I want to say about that is be flexible. And this is something that I learned kind of the hard way is, you feel like when you're in charge of something like this, that what you set up in the beginning has to be what you carry through all the way to the end of the project. And that's not the case. So what do I mean by that? If you start out with a team of 5 people and you are implementing a new software and you just realize that your team is inundated with work, then, add more people to that team and, that's okay. And likewise, if you have 20 people working on a project and you realize, hey, maybe this is too much and we're using too much overtime, or this is too disruptive for other projects and, we're eating up all the resources of our organization. Okay, scale it back a little bit. So, kind of, do your best to put the ego in the corner and just say, hey, listen, sometimes we don't have all the information at the beginning of a project and we just kind of have to just get started, which I highly recommend. Do the planning, figure stuff out, but really get started. Just get started. And be flexible along the way. That's the name of the game in fire service project management is be flexible and be able to make changes on the fly. So, in summary, I would say, how do you implement a project management framework without overcomplicating things? Look back at historical precedent, be flexible, ask experts, and make sure that you're not just picking the maximalist approach possible. Scale your framework so that it's appropriate for the project you're doing, just like you would with ICS at a structure fire. Okay, next question. What are the most common reasons projects fail in fire departments and how can they be prevented? I actually love this question and so valuable because understanding why projects fail, I mean, obviously helps them not fail. And fire department projects tend to fail for the same few reasons, frankly. And the first one that I would say, and I see this all the time, and that is scope creep. And, to understand scope creep, basically, you start out with an objective. Hey, we're going to update our SORC response model for truck companies. And then someone comes in and says, well, hey, while you're doing that, why don't you also do rescue companies? And then someone's like, well, hey, if you're going to do, ladder trucks and rescues, you might as well do engine companies as well. Well, hey, since you're doing all those, you might as well just do all the SORCs. And so now you have what started as a relatively narrow project to fix one thing, and now it's all the different things. And the reason that this happens a lot in the fire department is because, there's a lot going on. Projects are complicated. People struggle with projects. This is not something that we're trained on. And so when you get a project going, you have a budget, you have momentum, you have positive, positive forward movement, and people see that, and, not in any kind of a sinister way. They want to get their work done as a part of your project. It's, pretty standard. And so it's incumbent on the project manager to use their good judgment when the scope needs to change. Because I'm not saying that the scope never needs to change. Sometimes it does. But you need to be careful when you add things to the scope of your project, because if you just balloon that scope out bigger and bigger and bigger, what happens is, how do I explain this? So the scope is so many things in the project are dependent on the scope. And this makes sense if you think about it, because the scope is like what we're going to do. And so you build your schedule based on that. Like, hey, if you want me to do this amount of work, it's going to take me this long. And the budget is the same. If you want me to do this amount of work, it's going to cost me this much money in overtime or whatever. And so if that scope changes, and it's like, okay, well, I told you that if you want me to do this amount of work, it'll take me this long and cost this much. But if you're doubling that work, well, it's probably going to double the schedule and it might double the budget. So just be aware that as a scope expands, so too does your schedule and your budget. And so too do your risks. The more work you're doing, the more risks there is to the project. So what I would say to that is, if you're the project manager, remember that you have a project sponsor. The project sponsor, of course, again, is the person who authorized the work. So maybe that's a deputy chief, it could be the fire chief, chief of staff, somebody like that, somebody that came to you and said, hey, get this done. And it's on their authority that this project work is being done. So in consultation with them and other people on your project team, you can expand the scope, but just be really careful about it and make sure that it's deliberate and for a good reason. Another reason that fire department projects fail, and I've seen this and I've been a part of it, and that is that typically a project manager, not typically, but sometimes a project manager gets brought in the middle of a project. So somebody has a good idea, a battalion chief, a deputy chief, a fire chief, somebody's got a good idea. They get the ball rolling, they reach out to a vendor, they get a few sample products, they, call a couple of different stakeholders, and then they realize, okay, well, this is actually a lot of work that I'm biting off and I've got a lot going on. Let's get so and so to handle this. So they bring in somebody and they say, hey, we need you to get this project done, and here's the information or whatever. And a lot of work has been already initiated. And so now the project manager not only has to figure out how to get this project done, but has to figure out what's already been done. And when it comes to starting a project in the middle as a project manager, it honestly, like, it really limits your options. It really limits your options. Think about if you're an incident commander at a fire and you get there at the very beginning and you're like, all right, let's use a 2.5. So pull the 2.5, take it to the second floor. Let's get the truck company to do this or that. But imagine if you show up in the middle of the fire and, an inch and three-quarter hand line's already been pulled to this floor and this floor, and the truck company's already positioned on the other side of the building from where you want them to be. It's not to say that you can't change those things, but it's really hard to undo the work that's already been done. And oftentimes you kind of just have to play it as it lies, as it were. So that can cause a lot of projects to fail because it really paints that project manager into a corner. So, that's tough, because what do you do about that? So I would say that, if you're a fire chief out there listening, bring your project manager in at the beginning. And that doesn't mean you can't, do some stuff on your own or, kind of explore some different options, but try to bring your project managers in at the beginning so that you don't paint them into a corner. And let's see, the last one I want to talk about is, we talked about having scope creep. Let's talk about having no scope at all. And man, this happens more than you would think. I mean, it really does. And what I mean is, like, we'll have a vague understanding of what we're trying to do. It'll be like, hey, we've got this, these thermal imaging cameras, and, we need to hand them out to everybody, essentially. And you're like, okay, okay, that sounds fine. We'll go around and we'll hand them out. But then it's like, hey, did anybody provide the new training on them because they function differently than the old ones? Oh, no, we didn't really think about that. Hey, did anybody update the SOG to, include the new operating this or that, or how we want them to be stored? They need to be charged here versus there, and that we've set it up so that this station is in charge of fixing them or whatever. No, nobody did that. Hey, did anybody communicate about what was supposed to be done with the old thermal imaging cameras? No, and now actually we're missing two of them. We don't even know where they are. Oh, great. Well, that's a problem. So that's an example of trying to do a project without a scope. You just get like an objective, like, oh, hand out these thermal imaging cameras. But if you had done a scope, it would have said, provide communication to the district about how you want the old ones to be collected and what you want the new ones to look like in storage and in maintenance. And we need to provide training. We need to update policies. We need to do this. We need to do that. And so it's it's critical that, and let me take a step back. A scope doesn't need to be this hyper complicated 50-page document or whatever. A scope can be something that is as simple as two columns, and those columns can be in bullet points. Column number one is what is in scope, and column number two, what is out of scope. So if you're doing the thermal imaging camera project, what's in scope? Provide training to the fire department via Target Solutions. Collect all the old thermal imaging cameras. Distribute new thermal imaging cameras. Update SOG, such and such. And provide an inventory of collected old thermal imaging cameras. What's out of scope? Providing training at live fires, or inventorying equipment not related to the thermal imaging cameras, or setting up a maintenance program for the new thermal imaging cameras. And it just basically says, this is what we're going to do, and this is what we're not going to do. That prevents the scope creep that we talked about earlier. Because then someone says, hey, we got live fire coming up in a month. And since you were involved in passing out the new thermal imaging cameras, why don't you teach a class on that right before we do the new live fire revolutions? And so that's how that scope can expand and expand and expand. So having that scope on the front end, what we're going to do and what we're not going to do, helps you make sure that you achieve the comprehensive list of your objectives, and that comprehensive list of objectives doesn't just keep ballooning out further and further and further. Okay, let's see what else we got here. How do you manage projects effectively across A, B, and C shifts with limited overlap? Man, that is a phenomenal question. So, when I very first got started on this rabbit hole of fire department project management, one of the things that was so interesting to me is, project management as a discipline has been used since like the 40s, since like the 1940s, and it's everywhere. It's in the tech sector, it's in finance, the Army uses it, the Defense Department is using it. Everybody does project management except the fire department. And that blew my mind. Why is that the case? And so I started doing a ton of research into, like, why does project management struggle to be adopted in the fire department, despite the fact that everybody else is using it and has been for, the better part of 100 years. And one of the big factors here is our shift schedules, the sort of the breakdown of shifts. Now, of course, we're not the only people that have shift schedules. Police do that, other sheriffs do it, other not 911 people do it, but it's an obstacle that we have to clear. And that obstacle is made up of a few components. The first is that we are the bulk of a fire department's workforce is in operations. So, if you have like the department I work for, it's got nearly 700 sworn firefighters, and of those, I don't know, like 600 and some are in operations. And so if you have a big project and you need people, you need that manpower, the likelihood is that that manpower is going to come from operations because that's where the majority of your people are, right? That just makes sense. So then you fall into, okay, well, we're going to bring in 6 people from operations to help with this project. Well, these guys are on A shift, these guys are on B shift, and these guys are on C shift. So if we want to have a meeting, a third of these people are not going to be here on any given day. Okay, that's a challenge. And then you have the problem of, like depending on how your shift cycle breaks down, on vacations and all that, people aren't there Monday through Friday, to work on stuff. And so there's a couple really important things I think you can do to overcome this. The first is, and it's nothing new, it's nothing revolutionary, utilizing remote work technology. And remote work technology is a fancy way of saying Zoom or a Teams call. And this just allows people to be present for your meetings from a remote location. And so I always, well, I shouldn't say always, 90% of the time when I set up a project meeting, I make it a virtual option. So we use Microsoft Suites for my fire department. So I always click the option when I send out the invitation for the meeting to make it a Teams meeting, to create a Teams meeting. And that just means, hey, look, if you're at the firehouse and you need to step away from, to take this meeting or whatever, we're going to provide that option for you. Or if you're at a conference and you want to jump on this, you can do Teams on your phone. You can put your AirPods in and you can listen and be a part of the conversation. So just creating those virtual options so that people can participate from locations other than fire department headquarters is really, really beneficial. The other thing that I would say about that is having that communication plan that we talked about earlier is a really, really powerful tool because it sets clear expectations. So people on the team are aware of when you're going to be reaching out to them and what the expectations for them reaching back out to you are. Like you can say, hey, I'm going to check in on Wednesdays and we're going to have a team meeting on Monday. Great. Well, they have an idea of what to expect and they know what's expected of them. So setting those expectations out at the beginning of a project can be a great way to ensure you have consistent communication throughout. So another thing that I really like doing is when you have projects that are heavy on operational people, and a lot of projects tend to be this way, by the way, where you'll have like, I don't know, 10 people. Like we did a big project 2 years ago, I guess it was, where we had to open a pharmacy for our fire department, which, as I said, we're a pretty big department, 700 sworn members, 23 fire stations, which is big, And so opening a pharmacy to support that fire department, which has, we had to come up with a distribution system, a reverse distribution system to pick up used kits. I had to have a compliance, policy and system. We had to have an internal tracking system that we had to develop. We had to train 700 firefighters on how to use it. We had to do a pilot test, all these different things. And so we had a big team. I think we had a 15-person project team, and at least half of them were in operation. And with a project like that, it's really valuable to ensure that the people that are on a consistent schedule, like the admin folks, like if you have a captain or a lieutenant or whomever that's in administration, you want to lean heavily on those people as the sort of like coordinators of the project because they're going to add that element of consistency because they're going to be at every meeting for the most part because they work a 9 to 5. They're going to be, you have a lot more control over their schedule versus somebody that's maybe on shift work. So having a well-balanced team, if you have a lot of operations people, you want to make sure you have some admin people just because of the consistency and the reliability of their schedule. So, in summary, yes, it can be challenging having A, B, and C shift and having people in remote locations and all this other sort of stuff, but you can overcome that. You have virtual work technology like Zoom or Teams. You can establish strong communication foundations at the beginning of your project, and then also just strive to have a well-balanced team of operations people and admin people, whether those are sworn admin people or civilian admin people, to balance out the not inconsistencies, the variability of operational shifts. All right, let's see. I think we have time for at least one more here. Okay, here we go. How do you overcome cultural resistance to change in a fire department? Man, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? Change management in the fire department is hard. It's really, really hard. And, I've talked to enough people in enough different industries to know that change is always hard. It's not just the fire service. I think we maybe get stuck thinking like, oh, we're the only people that struggle with changing or adaptation or whatever. And that's not true. Everybody struggles with it. But, you know, it is definitely true that it's harder in the fire service. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. Um, Firefighters, the old quote, firefighters hate change and the status quo, or however it goes. And that's true. And it's not just that firefighters are ossified or that they don't want, new things or whatever. There's good reasons for that. There's good psychological reasons for that. We have a very um, variable job. You have no idea. You come in for the day, you could go on barely any calls, you could go on the worst call of your life or whatever. And so we like to hold on to the things that give us a sense of stability. And so that's for that reason we don't want to, adopt new things all the time just for the sake of change. And also, there's something that I call the proficiency tax, which is that, if you're like an 80 out of 100 level firefighter, but you're working with equipment that you're familiar with people that you're familiar with, in a district you're familiar with, maybe that takes you from an 80 out of 100 firefighter to a 90 out of 100 firefighter. And if you take those things away, that is what I refer to as the proficiency tax. And so, in a job where your safety depends on your proficiency and the safety of your peers depends on your proficiency, it is worrisome, and it can cause anxiety to charge that proficiency tax. And so firefighters will resist things like a new 12 lead monitor or new radios or whatever because they, on some level are aware, hey, I'm going to, for a time, be less proficient as I learn to use this new equipment and build new habits and systems to use it. So there's good reasons why change is difficult or why firefighters resist change. And there's a really good book. I've talked about it before on the podcast, and it's called Switch. And it's by two brothers, Chip and Dan Heath. And a really good book, by the way. Strongly recommend it. And they talk all about how to change things, how to change anything. And they have a rider, an elephant, and a path model. Or basically, like imagine you've got a guy riding an elephant down a path. And the three parts of the change are the rider, the elephant, and the path. And the rider represents the logical, analytical part. The elephant represents the emotional part, and the path represents the environment. And you need to consider and address all three of those elements. So you need to make the analytical case for the change. Hey, this new 12 lead monitor, we have to use it because the other one didn't pass the FDA, whatever. And so we can't use it anymore. So this is why we have to go to the new one. Okay, well, that makes logical sense. Then you address the emotional part. Like, hey, I understand this is going to be a big change and you might be worried. How are you going to handle cardiac arrest with a new monitor? You were comfortable with the old one. Shrink that change. Hey, we're going to provide this training and that training, and we're going to, have a buffer period where you have the old monitor on your apparatus for, a few months in case there's an emergency. And so you shrink the change, make it less intimidating. And then there's the environment, which is, like, hey, we're going to, provide this documentation and this thing, and we're going to put a tablet on the ambulance, which has, this guide or whatever. So you basically like create like environmental factors, which make that change easier. And, I don't know, that's kind of a rough approximation of the book. So I highly recommend you read it. They do a much better job of explaining it, but I think it represents the sort of interconnected nature of change. And, I think that, and this is, man, this is so basic, but it's worth saying. Communication is so important. Communication throughout the change process is so important. Give people warning. Hey, this is coming. This is why it's coming. Now, obviously, that sort of abates the rumor mill and people just kind of filling in the blanks or writing their own narrative. So communicate extensively when you're changing big cultural things like safety equipment or schedules or anything that's like a big element of a firefighter's life. You're going to really want to maybe over communicate on things like that. And, of course, part of communication is listening. It's not just talking, it's listening. And so having, the paradigm where leadership is really listening to the guys and girls on the line and understanding the concerns they have. And, I think that there's with change management, there has to be an element of trust that an organization has in their leadership that, hey, they're not just going to change stuff because they get bored up there in the office and they're looking for stuff to do. So they just decide, hey, we're going to change something for fun. Um, and there has to be a level of trust there. And so it's incumbent, I think, on the organization, the leadership of an organization to be judicious and be thoughtful about change, understand the proficiency tax and the anxiety that can cause. And, yeah, things do need to change. Sometimes new technology comes out. Sometimes we learn new things about tactics or the hazards of the job, or, we have the sort of like black swan events like COVID, and change is necessary. But when it is, be thoughtful about it and, help to build that organizational trust that, these guys aren't just going to change stuff for no reason. And if things do change, there's a good reason for it. And maybe, and that's where the communication comes in. We understand why this is happening, and we have a chance to make our thoughts and feelings on it known. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on change management. And again, I can't recommend that book Change highly, or Switch. Switch is the name of the book. I can't recommend that book highly enough. Great book to understand how to actually change things in your organization. Well, guys, that's all the time we've got for today. Thanks again for listening to Project Command. And again, please help us out by sharing this episode, liking, subscribing, leaving us a review on your platform of choice, really whatever. You are our advertising, so please help us out. And again, keep an eye out for our book, Project Management in the Fire Service. We're going to be having a lot more discussions and a lot more information coming out about that soon. And, hit us up at FDIC. Me and Duke will be there, and we'd love to connect with you. So hit us up on LinkedIn or at Project Command Podcast at gmail.com. Project Command Podcast at gmail.com. Thanks again for listening. I'm Captain Peter Eunice, and this is Project Command, bringing command level thinking to every project in the fire service.